Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you are, and welcome to Chatham House to our special session on what next for Afghanistan. My name is Renata Dewan, I'm the Deputy Director here, and I'm really delighted to bring together 4 think tanks, in fact 5 if we think of our UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub colleagues, to explore today one of the most critical and urgent humanitarian crises in the world. That is a deeply rooted political and developmental crisis as well, at a time when, quite understandably, the world is preoccupied with developments in Ukraine and facing challenges around the world with regard to food security and COVID recovery challenges. Now, the situation in Afghanistan since the takeover of the Taliban in August 2021 has been rightly seen as a significant and indeed almost unprecedented crisis. But of course, Afghanistan's challenges are not new. It has been one of the most aid-dependent countries in the world over several decades, and a country that faces significant vulnerable shocks, including drought, climate change, and other natural disaster and challenges. Over the past 4-6 months, and at the initiative of Ben Ramalingam, the Executive Director of the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub, 4 think tanks, Chatham House, the Institute for Development Studies, the Centre for Global Development, and the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, have come together to explore what are the options that can be explored for delivery of assistance to Afghanistan in the context of a non-recognized authority in that country? What are the most vulnerable needs? Who and how can aid be provided? Why and how to respond? Well, there is, of course, the scale of need of Afghan people and facing this unprecedented crisis. There's also the question of spillover and the challenges that Afghanistan poses for regional and indeed Eurasian security and development. And then third, of course, has been how can we think about preserving some of the gains that that country has made over the past 2 decades. We have a super panel to discuss these questions today and to share some of the findings of what has been a super inclusive process with over 150 participants engaging with this in this exercise. I'm not going to introduce their full brief biographies in detail, but let me just briefly flag their deep expertise in Afghanistan, on South Asia, and indeed on development issues over many years. And then we'll kick off straight away with their interventions. First, I'm delighted to introduce Mark Bowden, Associate Fellow from Chatham House and a long expert and friend on Afghanistan. Immediately below him on my screen, we have Hamid Hakimi, also one of my colleagues from Chatham House and himself an Afghanistan-born citizen. We are also joined by Jeremy Alouf, Professorial Fellow at IDS, the Institute for Development Studies, and Alistair McKechnie, Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute and a long-standing Afghanistan expert, also previously with the World Bank. Finally, but by no means least, it's a great pleasure to have again with us Dr. Orsala Nemat from SOAS, herself an Afghan person and someone with great expertise on issues regarding gender and human rights in that country. Now, this session today is on the record. It's going to be posted on our Chatham House website, so you'll be able to follow and record these discussions for future use. We are going to be talking about various papers that have been prepared by this initiative. They're all available on all 4 institutes' websites, and please don't hesitate to be in touch if you'd like further details after the discussion. If you'd like to engage, and please do intervene, engage, pose your questions, could I ask you to put your questions or comments in the Q&A? You can upvote if there's a question that strikes you as particularly relevant and important, and we'll try to get to as many as we can over the course of the discussion. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn to Mark to introduce to us a little bit more about the Afghanistan Strategic Learning Initiative and its key findings. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Renata, and apologies for my normal fumbling to find the unmute button to everybody. I'm delighted to be able to talk about the ASLI initiative at this stage because it's been a very interesting and important process to go through. The initiative was initiated by concern over the need to respond effectively to the immediate needs of Afghanistan and appropriately and to do that and to sustain as far as possible the development gains that had been that had taken place. In doing so, I think we were also keen to recognize the challenges that were inherent in the rapid, unanticipated takeover by the Taliban. Ben Ramalingam had the idea of the approach that we took on this, which was funded and supported by FCDO through the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub, and set out to find some solutions to the unique challenges of the crisis facing Afghanistan through a sequence of processes, one through scenario development, which looked much at the political and economic scenarios, secondly through the analysis of vulnerability, followed by a review of the aid modalities and mechanisms for response, and recognizing the need for a common and consistent approach by donors through collective action. The result has been, as Renata has highlighted, a fascinating collection of papers which are all now available, and a synthesis report which we produced today and is also available. I would like to, at this stage, thank my colleagues at ASLI, and particularly Mark Began, who has been instrumental in bringing us all together and making sure that the process has moved forward effectively. So the other point I'd like to make about this, unfortunately, CGD, who are one of the participants, are not available to join us today, but I would like to thank all the other participants for the amount of work that went into this, and also to reflect in their papers the level of debate that took place. And much of this process, I think, has been valuable through the discussions and the workshops that took place. And I hope very much that the papers now and the synthesis report reflect the debate that's taken place, because underlying a lot of this, I think, is a concern about both the level of engagement from the international community and the nature of engagement. And I thought in this context, it was important to actually look at what has changed since the initiative started and where we are now when we've finally completed the synthesis report. First of all, I think that it's important to recognize that the Ukraine crisis has overshadowed the immediate urgency that was felt about Afghanistan by the international community. But I think the Ukraine crisis has the potential to do more. It also changes the political direction of engagement. The Taliban may well feel that they can have closer alliances and support from China and Russia. And there's a shift in the international geopolitical balance that may well have an influence both on the nature of re-engagement, which reflects itself not only in the Security Council, but also in other challenges in delivering assistance to Afghanistan. So the Ukraine crisis is important, both in terms of the level of attention that's placed on the country, but also in the changing political shifts that take place. The second issue that I'd like to draw attention to is the political dynamics of the Taliban, which were explained in the original Chatham House scenarios as the current situation being a stuttering scenario. We have seen evidence of this, and Renata also mentioned the fact that we don't know sufficiently much about the dynamics of the Taliban. But the recent decisions about girls' education and the dissolution of key institutions, such as the Human Rights Institution, create a new challenge, particularly about the nature of engagement, the issues of conditionality, and raise the debate about how effective conditionality might be, whether the Taliban indeed have responded to the cautious engagement by the West because of what they see as delays in re-engagement, and whether that hardens the views of some of the Taliban there. The other development that I think we've seen take place is relating to the humanitarian appeal, which reached 2 billion, and I think set the pattern for the future nature, for at least the nature of immediate assistance for the near future. Particularly, we have seen that Afghanistan has struggled through the winter crisis, and there is now a reduction in the indicators relating, particularly in the IPC indicators, of those in danger and extreme risk, which has reduction. But at the same time, there's a real challenge about whether longer term vulnerability has increased. There have also been attempts over the past few months at economic stabilization, with the US coming in to help support greater economic stabilization in terms of freeing up some of the access to money, though I would say that the major issues remain unresolved, and the need in particular to resolve the banking system remains critical. I understand from my colleagues in the NGO world that the Hawala system is not just remains as critical, but is under strain, and the banking system remains under strain. Moving on to the levels of engagement by the international community, there is a meeting with donors taking place at the moment under the 5+4+3 formula in Doha. And we're beginning to see the beginnings of donor re-engagement. But I should say there is still a lack of clarity on the ground for many organizations as to what levels of engagement they are allowed to take place, how they can engage with the Taliban at a local level. So there's slightly a need for a lack of, for more clarity. There is a need for more clarity on engagement with the Taliban, but a cautious movement by donors to move back in beyond humanitarian aid in this thing. And what's clear is that those donors who have maintained a presence on the ground or returned to a presence on the ground have begun to more cautiously engage and make it easier for operational agencies to be more effective. It's also clear, I think, that the role of the UN will remain critical in this. The UN's mandate has been extended for a year and renewed. There's been a restructuring of the UN, which recognizes its role in re-engagement. And it's clear that they will become the main channel for re-engagement, indeed, through taking on the trust funds, particularly in the area of health, but also looking at education. Education clearly is very much stalled at the moment. The presence of the UN means that they will be maintaining a human rights presence and maintaining a donor coordination function. They have shown, I think, leadership at the moment, particularly in an environment that appears to be becoming more difficult for NGOs in terms of the reenactment of new legislation, or should we say a return to existing legislation that is going to be tough for the NGOs, and the UN is showing leadership in taking on these issues to create a more effective operating environment. So I thought it was just important, before we go into the discussions that we have and the presentations from the individual presenters, to provide that update, to show what the future of aid may be like. And I think the future of re-engagement for Afghanistan in the near future will be primarily humanitarian, with some extension and engagement cautiously into some of the structures that we talked about, like the community development councils, re-engagement in broader issues than just humanitarian, but essentially under a UN umbrella at the moment. So with that, let me hand you back to Renata.
Mark, it's very helpful, I think, to get this context of where are we right now. And as you spoke, one of the questions in my mind was, to what extent might the Ukraine crisis actually drive a faster or a more move towards donor engagement as donors seek to balance and navigate these multiple crises? I was also struck by your reference to perhaps a potential role for the UN in terms of both delivery of aid to Afghanistan, as well as some of the signaling and the mechanisms that you talked about, including on messaging on human rights. I did have one question to you, which is on the emphasis you put on the economic stabilization, the urgency of economic stabilization, the currency crisis, in particular, the need to get some form of a banking system engaged. Is that an area that you see the UN leading, or is it an area that necessarily requires donor engagements or international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF?
I think it requires broader engagement in the UN. I think a variety of mechanisms are going to be needed. I still think it remains important to unlock the assets that have been taken from Afghanistan and to recognize the importance of a central banking system. And that's far more a donor issue than it is a UN issue.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I'm going to turn now to the panel that we've had that context setting, and to our first speaker, Hamid Hakimi, who is one of the authors of the synthesis report. Hamid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Renata. I'm going to talk about the Chatham House paper, which our senior fellow Gareth Price and I have co-authored. The scenarios were mainly developed really as an initial step to look at the realities on the ground and examine the likely policy impact of these developments that we were all tracing. There was also the additional aim to ensure that we're not really providing a range of probabilities and a barometer for which scenario would be more probable than the other, but more really to point out, identify a range of possible pathways. So in terms of the exercise, it was an iterative and a very consultative process. We did speak amongst our community of researchers, but also widely within our ASLI network. The scenarios were conceived around 5 issues that we agreed had significant impact on the shaping of decisions of the international community vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So the nature of internal Taliban approach to governance, how are the Taliban going to deal with resuscitating, a system of governance, the regional environment and the international relations with the de facto authorities in this regard was also the second thing we considered in devising the scenarios. The third one was the economic development in Afghanistan. The security and crime situation was also a consideration and considering the scenarios, and the population needs and human impact of different trajectories. So in terms of coming up with the scenarios, we came up with 4. And, arguably you could say that you could have come with an infinite number of these scenarios, but what we wanted to do was to anchor them, as I said, in the conditions on the ground and the realities of Afghanistan. So the 4 potential scenarios we considered was what we called stuttering, which was the continuation of a situation where the Taliban try to consolidate. They manage internal factions, but that becomes their priority, but also seeking international recognition becomes a priority. So very much, as Mark pointed out, we are still in the stuttering situation. The other one that we considered was imploding. So what factors would have to come in so that there is an internal fragmentation of the Taliban, potential fragmentation? What does that mean for all these 5 areas of the governance, regional environment, and security, population needs, and so on? The third thing we considered, the third scenario, was a scenario of exploding, and that was it kind of built on the imploding. So what happens when the Taliban, it involves, it's a security situation that really deteriorates in Afghanistan, it spills over to the region or even beyond that. What are the implications of such a scenario? And the fourth scenario was what we call progressing, and it for us we considered a possible trajectory towards some kind of optimistic outcome. And in the case of the progressing, the scenario suggests the consolidation of a more sort of tentatively sort of improved Taliban rule that would involve some kind of a shift to from security and consolidating their internal factionalism to providing broader focus on population, also improved security conditions, improved environment for international engagement, and some kind of a pathway towards an international acceptance. Interestingly, in the exercise that we had, the workshop, it was the scenario 4, the kind of the optimistic scenario that we wanted to kind of see the trajectory for an optimistic scenario that really had a lot of reservation among the experts, because there's definitely a tension between striking a balance for engagement with the de facto authorities in Afghanistan, but also a potential danger in validating the repressive behavior of the Taliban. So in terms of kind of the overall learning from this exercise, we had certain kind of considerations to make. One was obviously that the Taliban are a multifactional coalition, so there's so much that is still unknown about them, particularly in regards to their approach to governance. Although unlike the 1996 period when they came to Kabul, this time around they have inherited at least a skeleton or a structure of a state that was functioning, even if it had limitations. There was a state structure that they've inherited. And it seemed that the Taliban have actually warmed up to the idea of adopting that structure. Of course, the caveat is that they've, as we see recently, they've got rid of the Human Rights Commission, the Oversight Commission for the implementation of Constitution. So there's been some institutional shutdowns, but the Women's Rights Ministry, for example, was replaced by the Ministry for Vice and Virtue. But largely speaking, from an engagement perspective, international engagement perspective, we feel that the assessment that we had of the situation shows that the Taliban have largely adopted the state structure. So what does that mean really going forward? When, of course, we still don't really, as I said, know exactly how the Taliban conceive of government and conceive of governance. There's also the other unknown is in our view, especially this paper for Chatham House, is that how much the regional and international developments will continue to impact the nature and external interventions in Afghanistan. So we talked about the Ukraine crisis, but also what happens with regard to Central Asia, with regard to Pakistan. Sri Lanka is the crisis in Sri Lanka, for example, is something that wasn't there when we held this exercise of scenario building. And also, what are the Taliban's shifting position going to tell us going forward, especially on the issues of rights for Afghans, the governance and terrorism? Not just governance issue, but also their own interactions with the international community. There was a lot of anticipation with regard to the girls' secondary schools, being opened, and girls would be allowed to go back. But then at the sort of last hour, that was changed. It was quite unpredictable even for those who were engaging with the Taliban at that moment. So all in all, what the scenarios tell us is it gives us a trajectory, a pathway to examine the realities on the ground vis-a-vis international engagement. But each scenario obviously gives us the challenge of, you know, these various superseding issues that come and impact Afghanistan. Also, in terms of a key outcome was that, as I said, the view on engagement with the Taliban at the international community's level is still something that needs to be worked out. And therefore, I think one of the key learnings, because we were the first to kick off the initiative, so obviously we were setting the scene very much, you know, as opposed to coming up with any kind of policy recommendations at that stage. One of the key learnings that we had from our contribution to the ASLI was that there is certainly a high level of reservation amongst the political and analyst community of the political analyst community, but also the developmental actors and the international community in general with regards to a balancing act with the Taliban. You know, to what extent could you balance? How do you balance your engagement with the Taliban? That doesn't look like you're validating the regime, but at the same time trying to support institutions that are still there, the indigenous institutions of Afghanistan and the structures, both at the community level, but also probably nationally. And so that remains to be something that we would like to continue to watch and work on. And I'll be very happy to take questions after this. I think that is my time.
Thank you so much, Hamid. And I think what you point out is that there's many known unknowns, to use that much misused phrase, but known unknowns about Taliban thinking, Taliban assessment, which in a way militates towards discussion and engagement. And at the same time, one has this question of to what extent to engage, who benefits from, what signals does it send, and how to usefully engage. You flagged right at the end the importance of local community engagement as potentially an alternative. To what extent is it an alternative to engaging with Taliban? And that I hope we'll be able to unpack now. As part of these scenarios, the next step was to identify key needs and vulnerabilities in Afghanistan at present and to build off the scenarios to say, where are the most urgent needs now? So I'm going to return to Jeremy and Jeremy Alouche from IDS, who will walk us through some of the thinking and the identification of priority vulnerability areas that we came up with. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Renata, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everybody. So it's a pleasure to present this report that was co-authored by 3 other authors. I won't have the time really to go into the sort of details, and I really encourage you to go and see on our website and download it. So let me start really with some of the key learnings, and especially the 2 first points. Essentially that chronic poverty and structural vulnerability are at the roots of the current humanitarian crisis, and that these sort of underlying factors have been compounded by the sort of short-term liquidity and banking crisis on the one hand that we've been talking about, but also the sort of second severe drought in 3 years that are affecting many issues, especially around food security. And we wanted to develop these points in parallel. Why? It's quite clear that the sort of Taliban takeover has sort of temporarily cut off Afghanistan from the international order, with obviously severe consequences for the country's financial sector and banking services. The same with the severe drought and the ongoing economic effects of the COVID pandemic. And it's quite clear, one cannot deny that the situation for the poorest and the most vulnerable has dramatically worsened, at least in the short term. It was also clear that Afghanistan faces multiple and interrelated crises, linking on the one hand rural and urban poverty with food security issues, disasters, and access to basic services. And the report goes into detail into each of these aspects. However, having said that, what we wanted to emphasize is that our sort of analysis and needs and vulnerability need to move away from a focus that really sort of focuses on sort of the effects of the sort of unplanned withdrawal and you can see the recent report this week of the Foreign Affairs Committee about that, about the effects of the sanctions, about the urgent humanitarian calls, because in some ways these simple narratives, despite their importance, also may drive us away from the more structural issues being faced in Afghanistan. Whether we talk about women's norm, children's rights, and ethnic discrimination are still the basis of a sort of Afghan societal structure, and that these structural vulnerabilities are socially imposed risk factors, which result from socio-economic, cultural, and cultural hierarchies. And these obviously shouldn't be disregarded because they have obviously a very important impact on poverty reduction, on access to basic services, on disaster reduction. For example, if we just take the example of the health sector in Afghanistan, Afghanistan still has worse infant mortality rates in the world, and women and girls' access to healthcare is still below international standards. So I think it's really important basically to situate these sort of immediate needs and vulnerability issues within larger structural issues that still haven't not been tackled. Secondly, looking forward, while the impact of the immediate economic shock is negative, the participants in the workshop, and let me emphasize that the findings that I will be presenting are not just from ideas, but from the fantastic contribution of all the people that contributed to this workshop. We recognize that the sort of consequences are very much unpredictable in the medium term. Although there's plenty of data on the current drivers of vulnerability in Afghanistan, their reliability and limited availability since the Taliban takeover makes scenario planning a difficult exercise in terms of needs and vulnerability. The third point that we emphasize is quite straightforward, but is worth emphasizing in the light of the current dominant narrative, which is basically that although humanitarian aid is of paramount importance to alleviate immediate needs, it cannot substitute for the basic functioning of basic services and rural institutions in the medium term. And then fourthly, which is very much related, is that the Taliban is responsible for providing for the predation it controls, and aid agencies, which is very much an old debate, but that keeps repeating itself, should not unthinkingly substitute for government services when internal resources are available. We've got to learn from history, and in some ways that sort of parallel new systems are very much unsustainable in the long term, but also may struggle to deliver in the short term. UN agencies cannot achieve national coverage of health or education outside of government-run systems that have been taking so long to build up in some ways. At the community level, obviously, one question that we've talked about, to what extent we can use community development councils to deliver assistance and development projects despite long-standing flaws. And finally, easily said than done, there's a need to find creative ways to support functioning institutions, build trust, and expand the political space for this kind of intervention. So next slide, please. So what I've been trying to emphasize is that we need to shift this emergency focus of tackling vulnerability. And if this approach is followed, we came up with 4 different sort of key requirements. So the first one is essentially that any engagement on vulnerability needs to be based on building trust. And that would require very much a sort of transparent sector-by-sector approach that would provide, we believe, the first building step in building this trust. Secondly, addressing vulnerability should not be at the expense of the various institutions that have benefited from the heavy investment by the international community. The third point is that we need to be very much aware of the sort of political dynamic and the sort of heightened expectation among sort of Taliban foot soldiers is going to heavily influence any proposed action on vulnerability. So aid programs should be designed realistically, underpinned by a solid political economist analysis. And then finally, we got to recognize to what extent we are not also perpetuating, an aid-dependent economic system. So these are really sort of, we believe, key fundamental policy issues to start thinking about the type of policy engagement that we can think in terms of needs and vulnerability in Afghanistan. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I think what you present very clearly is that thinking in terms, as much of the debate has been so far, about education or schools, or thinking about healthcare in and of itself will not solve this much more structural and systemic challenges faced by Afghanistan before, during, and after Taliban control, which is really a question of a high level of aid dependency and very fractured trust at all levels of society and between international community actors and Afghan actors. So I think that is a really interesting theme, you say. You also highlight, I think, this question of what it's perceived to be that the Taliban needs to give to its supporters will heavily influence what it will seek and what is prepared to work with donors and engagement. That sets us up, I think, very well for our next speaker, Alistair McKechnie from ODI. It's really trying to look at, well, what are the collective options for international actors in responding to the scale of need in Afghanistan, which I think is uncontested, but the much more difficult issue of how do you deliver that and to whom and in what ways? And I think very much also, how do you defend that at home at a time of heightened energy prices, a time of resource scarcity, a time of challenge of inflation at home? How do you make the case for collective action and commitment to Afghanistan? Alistair, over to you.
Thank you very much, Renata. Let me again say how pleased we are at ODI to have participated in this. We had a team of 5 co-authors, and we're also very grateful to the ideas, the discussion we had at the workshop as the concepts of this paper evolved. Next slide, please. By collective action, we really mean how one or more parties can work together on reaching common objectives that would be either much more difficult or impossible if they were to act unilaterally. We did some analysis of the past engagement in Afghanistan, which I'm not going to go through at all at this session. It's there in the paper for those who are interested, because it is important to understand what happened in the past in order to inform what we might do moving forward. We basically looked at 3 main core issues for international collective action, which is really about coordination, it's about coherence, it's about bringing all the actors together to come up with with interventions that have a much greater impact and respond to the huge needs of the Afghan people. The first one is about operational engagement with the Taliban, Afghan institutions, and Afghan civil society. The second is, how should aid delivery be adapted to the new situation in Afghanistan? And the third is really the big issue, how to navigate the very complicated political economy of Western and other actors. Next slide. It's important to note at the beginning that the issue is not whether to talk to the Taliban, but how to talk to them, because there is a lot of discussions, operational type discussions going on between humanitarian organizations, the United Nations, some other institutions, and officials in the Taliban de facto government. And we have identified 3 key bilateral, multilateral actors that essentially shape the scene for how collective action could unfold in the future. First is the United States, and there the United States has enormous influence because of its essentially control of the international financial system and of its size. And as I think others have said, despite the waivers, the sanctions still constrain humanitarian development. Commercial banks essentially avoid Afghanistan due to de-risking because of the fear of running foul of the sanctions rules, which are very, very complicated. There's also the risk of legal action on NGOs, for example, who inadvertently violate sanctions. And the international financial institutions are essentially blocked from engagement in Afghanistan. United Nations, the second major actor, there is the humanitarian appeal, which raised significant amounts of money, but still considerably less than what they asked for. There are a lot of people at the workshop have raised concerns about the risks of dominant UN channels, about waste, about bypassing institutions, creating aid dependence, and so on. And also the UN itself has its own sanctions regime, which is now shifting away from security, terrorism, towards human rights and gender. And then we have the two biggest international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, and they have their own internal legal and political constraints to dealing with de facto governments that apply to almost any non-constitutional change of government anywhere. They do have a lot of technical expertise which is needed, especially on payments, payment system, budgets, and so on. And they have in the past managed trust funds, but there needs to be some way of finding entry points for the IFIs, trust funds, or perhaps a much deeper association with the UN. Next slide, please. This slide's rather dense, but when we look at beyond the immediate term, beyond the stuttering scenario, what might the international community do to try and shift to a more productive engagement that benefits the people of Afghanistan? First point, I think, is looking at nuanced, differentiated approaches to engagement. And we've mentioned, as mentioned before, about the Taliban as a coalition of factions, and there's certainly a lot of the research points in that direction. And I think that we would also suggest that the need to distinguish among the Taliban as a political authority, the state institutions that they may control, and then you have the Afghan people and the organizations that articulate their voice. And we're saying it's the people should be at the center of this, but we then need to think about how we would engage with these other parts of the regime. Second point here is as this is a coalition of factions, you may be able to separate out different parts of the Taliban that one can deal with and actually empower the more constructive parts of the emirate. It's important to work with civil society, and none of this will happen without a political economy analysis. Second point is about a principled approach to international engagement, but which is accountable to the people of Afghanistan. I think the first point is we need to recognize that the leverage of sanctions, conditionality, and compacts is limited and in our view has been exaggerated. After all, the Taliban think they won. They are a movement that came to power on the strength of Afghan nationalism, and I think the losers trying to dictate policy is going to be at least difficult. I think there are issues of ways of bypassing the government on areas such as girls' education, rather than using education aid as a bargaining chip, which really would be quite detrimental to the people of Afghanistan. And there's already been discussion about enabling locally owned institutions like community development councils, but these have to be seen as indigenous Afghan institutions rather than something created in the past by donors. And finally, the very important point about maintaining and building upon past investment in service delivery. I mean, Afghanistan in many ways was quite successful in service delivery for a country of its income level. And there have been an enormous investment in institutions that will decay if they're left alone and underfunded. There are issues of salaries, payments, trust funds, and how to strengthen and permit the international institutions to resolve what are fundamentally political questions. Next slide, please. The last part of the paper is really how to navigate the politics of Western and other actors, because the heart of the issues we're talking about are really political, and they are often within the politics of the partner countries. I think the first point we would say is that the political opposition in these countries is real. It goes it's not something that governments or officials have dreamt up. It really has its roots in the population and their revulsion to Taliban behavior in the 1990s and some of the things they have done since they have come to power. And I think it's important to communicate that to the Taliban, the consequences, the risks of certain policies. I think there are common ground. There are self-interests of the partner countries, the Western countries, like migration and security. And I think also there's this common ground with the Taliban on some of these issues, particularly humanitarian response and security. I'm talking about the Islamic State. The third is that if we say, well, let's just concentrate on humanitarian aid, this can skew the whole response to become less effective. And if you look back to the early years of the engagement of Afghanistan in the early 2000s, there was a lot of aid delivered that was not effective and actually set back institutional development in Afghanistan. The second point, which has been made several times before, is understanding the Taliban regime and working with its constructive elements, which I'm not going to dwell upon. But I think the third point is building this consensus internationally on how humanitarian assistance can shift to a more development engagement, because that is needed to address the underlying drivers of the humanitarian crisis. We've already heard about the problems within the banking and payments system, how this is constraining humanitarian action. But a humanitarian-only approach also has problems like accelerating institutional decay, creating aid dependency, and ultimately Afghan resentment of an overbearing presence of foreigners. I think there are lessons from past engagement on trust funds, using them as coordination platforms as a means towards collective action. And finally, the need to bring back the fund and the bank and to strengthen UNAMA. And all of these multilateral organizations themselves represent a broad coalition of international collective action. Next slide, please. Next slide. And this is the last slide, is really how do we move forward and create modalities for a more effective international engagement with Afghanistan that's fundamentally changed, and in a world that is changing, particularly due to the crisis in Ukraine. And to try and solve these problems, we considered, and this came out at the workshop as well, of bringing together an eminent persons group to try and resolve some of these issues and have the visibility to articulate them to senior policymakers, politicians in the donor countries. And some of the points that might be on their terms of reference would be how should the arrangements for a multilateral system of support be organized? How do you improve the coordination arrangements between bilateral actors, countries, and the de facto government. So you don't have a competition among them and very incoherent incoherent assistance. The third is how do you actually manage humanitarian and development aid, and the lessons of the past are not encouraging as to what's been achieved so far. Next point I think is also very important, and is how to bring in the non-OECD partners into collective action arrangements, regional countries, China, some Middle Eastern countries, Turkey, for example, because I think the Taliban have shown some preference to engage with many of these countries, and they are going to be, I think, increasingly important in the future. What platforms for policy coherence, coordination, and accountability are needed? And above all, the final point, how do we strengthen the accountability of the humanitarian and aid system to the people of Afghanistan? So in a sense, we have not been able to resolve all these issues. And even if we have ideas on how they might be resolved, there is the issue of how to communicate these at the level where decisions are made in the industrialized and other countries. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alistair. I think there's lots of questions that come out that I hope you'll have time to explore in the Q&A that you raised. One is the question of salaries to civil servants and to state institutions and how to differentiate that from the Taliban regime. That, of course, in a context where for the last decade, we've worked to really thinking about coherence and state building and aid effectiveness built around seeing the state and its institutions as a collective. I think a second question that will come out is the question of the local community and who decides what represents local. How does one decide what is our local versus a Taliban local or something? So legitimacy, accountability, capacity, I think we might want to unpack, and it'll be great to hear some perspectives also from ASLI. But also I think your last point on the inclusion of non-OECD partners and thinking about engaging with countries of the region at a time of the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that really begs questions effectively about Russia and China, Pakistan and others in a moment in which the world is very much being I think, increasingly fragmented or grouping into systems. And so how do we think about groups that work across these states for the purposes of tackling a scenario in Afghanistan? So many more questions than answers, and it'd be great if we can get into it in discussions. But I'm very keen to bring in, before we complete the panel, ASLI Nemat's perspective. And in particularly, ASLI, it would be great to get your perspectives on some of the things you've heard, and in particular, many of the perspectives on what represents Afghan needs, accountability to the people of Afghanistan, and then articulating voice and people's perspectives in Afghanistan. Over to you, ASLI.
Thank you very much, Renata. Good day to everyone. Great pleasure and honor to join you all in this panel. And I'd like to extend my congratulations to all partners for presenting very important and timely set of papers. As someone who was part of the most of the conversations and discussions, I'm really pleased to see the report and the results. Before getting into the points that you mentioned, I'd like to further emphasize on the importance of continuing these conversations. To me, this initiative is a beginning, and it has to be continued because the situation is ongoing, it is evolving, and every phase of the situation, if we look at the last August onwards, every phase requires experts and specialized people's constructive conversations that results to better policies, to better services to people. So I hope those involved and those supporting these kind of initiatives listen to this and look into continuation of it. Actually, I don't have like structured presentations like the distinguished authors of the reports, but listening to all different parts I sort of make very quick 3-4 points and then leave it open for more conversation and answering the questions. But I believe some of my comments are probably answering the questions. Regarding the critical needs of the people, what is the Afghan needs and priorities? I think part of it is reflected in the presentations, also in the questions and answer part that I've mentioned. I definitely agree with the point regarding the salaries of the civil servants. The civil servants are part of the Afghan state machinery. And we all made this commitment as international partners, as international donors of Afghanistan, that we will contribute to state building. So if we really want to avoid the full collapse of the state institutions, we have to save it. And whether it is a donor-dependent state institution or not, it's a joint and shared responsibility in the failure of internationals as well as Afghans. That's a sad reality. But just because we made a mistake to make it fully externally dependent, we should not contribute further by stopping the salaries to basically lead it to collapse. So therefore, it's really important. And the most critical sectors, I'm not saying other sectors are unimportant, because I keep hearing relatives, friends, people that I know from different parts of the country who are losing their jobs, or who are getting very low salaries, or not salaries, or 1 month salary in 6 months, something like that. So every sector is important, but the most critical ones are health, education, and basically public services like Sharwali, like municipality and so forth. These are important because basic services ensures people's safety and security. Addressing the issues of malnutrition, the issues of acute starvation is very important. And based on my observation, despite a magnificent work of international aid organizations, local aid agencies, UN and everything, I still have reports of areas that are untouched, meaning nobody visited them. Districts in Afghanistan, areas, and mind you, the security and safety is not an issue. I invite or call on international organizations to get or communicate with the local areas in order to address these questions, because malnutrition is more worse in remote areas than probably in some of the areas closer by. Conversations earlier than me made that emphasis, but I want to sort of bring back very concretely on the importance of not entirely relating or relying on provision of humanitarian aid. It's very critical and important to address the issue of wheat shortage, which is a global challenge, and how it is going to be affecting the Afghans. So wheat distribution, fertilizers distributions is very important. It has to be identified as one of the urgent needs. Continuing to that, safe and drinking water, the access to water is a major issue. I heard through a network of humanitarian aid organizations working on the issues of water, and there is a very severe shortage of water that we are talking about, shortage of drinking water, agriculture water as well. We are also facing a lot of issues in terms of, the groundwater going down further, especially in the southern region, but also drinking water, shortage of drinking water is all across Afghanistan. And currently, as I speak, there are news of, floods, and, that also is destroying a lot of, areas with that. So I can go on, but these are the core priorities, and they are things that are, I think undoubtedly everyone, including the de facto authorities, the people of Afghanistan, donors, are all aware of these priorities, and it has to be sort of part of the operationalization of what services the international community provide. Now, the next part, I would like to sort of address the question of gender and human rights. Somehow, contrary to some of us expectations, the de facto authorities or the Taliban, despite their promises, they were not able to deliver on those promises that they made to the people of Afghanistan and that they made to the international community. One of those promises that are completely broken is the girls' education, the secondary and higher education. What is very important here to me as an Afghan and as someone who's closely following this situation is to find out what really works and what doesn't really work. I am afraid, I hope I will not make anyone offended, but somehow when I see that the call for girls' education and the call for human rights and women's rights keep coming by international actors, is maybe having a counter effect. on the de facto authorities. Now, how the de facto authorities came to power, how they started to gain control and everything is a separate question. We handed over power to them or they gain it is a separate question. We don't talk about it here. Now they are de facto ruling the country. What are the best ways to really engage instead of directly making sort of provocative statements? Sometimes it's important to empower and to rely on facilitating the Afghan voices. One thing I haven't seen, and I'm saying this again as an Afghan, is how many times the high authorities from UN or from other international agencies brought a group of just picking up from the street Afghans and says, can you listen to these people? I don't want to tell and lecture you what you need. Just listen to your own people. So facilitation of situations where Afghans can speak out their minds and can share their concerns is much more important than statements that we've seen that not really a fruit or provided results. I appreciate the meetings of the special UN representative on human rights. He's just completed an 11-day visit. It's very important. In the monitoring of human rights situation, we had problems even before the Taliban took over. Let's just be very honest with each other, all of us. There were issues. We had torturers, we had top human rights abusers at the top of the government without anyone addressing that. That's also part of the reality. The other part is now we are facing with some kind of false or unjustified or unverified reports that could not be. There are some really grave human rights violation that is happening that is left completely unreported. But there are also fabricated stories going on. My sort of suggestion in this regard is that the engagement should not be so much politicized or publicity or public or publicity or PR oriented. We don't need PR oriented just to please ourselves. That, okay, we have assigned someone who is taking care of it and is a very respectful person. Of course, he is a very respected person who is taking care of the human rights matters. But we should find ways to ensure that there is a very transparent mechanism for recording the human rights, verification of human rights violations. And also there is a very clear line of engagement with the authorities regards to these kind of violations that are happening by or being conducted by the authorities, and also other parties or actors that are also involved and also causing such violations. With regards to gender rights, again, I speak here as an Afghan woman who spent all her life into these struggles. I say that the more we rely on local voices of Afghan people in the cities and the rural areas and across Afghanistan, I think the more effective it will be in terms of Taliban listening. If Taliban consider themselves the local Afghans, they should listen to their local partners. And when it comes to the role or the level of power or leverage that the international community has, I think that is related to the donor funding, to the broader funding and support and resources arriving to Afghanistan. That has to be made clear that this is something, again, very important in terms of ethics of provision of services, that men and women, girls and boys, elderly, female and male, everyone is benefiting equally from these services. I think these are most important points with regards to engagement. When I'm just ending it here, to say that the people of Afghanistan should not pay the price of the mistakes of all of us, making them collectively Afghans and internationals. And therefore, having such engagements is really important, and way forward is to continue these conversations and with authorities themselves, what I wanted to emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula, and you bring out two really critical points. One is aid delivery through local community is not just a way of supporting Afghans and meeting vulnerable needs, but it's also potentially a way of facilitating dialogue that you say must be an Afghan to Afghan dialogue, and the importance of international actors in that. So I think that's really critical. Second, you've made some important suggestions and proposals about how human rights and gender points might be best articulated, and whether naming and shaming and broadcasting voices is what's needed, or whether more quiet Afghan to Afghan discussions and engagements might be more productive, getting back to the question of what will move the Taliban and what will impact the Taliban. And I think there what is also something that you is implicit in your remarks, which is how to balance these twin risks, because governments giving aid need to be seen by their own domestic populations to be making a strong pitch for human rights and gender issues. So it's quite a balance of the messages to whom and for whom and on behalf of whom, I think is really critical. I'm going to jump straight into the questions because we don't have so much time, and I'm going to, if I may, wrap up a few of them together. Alistair, there's a question that really of clarification to you from Sarjuddin Issa, that could you expand a bit more on what you meant by the aid architecture was broken prior to August 2021, something that Jeremy and also, or Salah, you even talked about when you said, let's not overemphasize how wonderful the world was just before that. Alistair, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Renata. I think by the aid architecture broken, we meant the whole structure of aid coordination and the gaps between the rhetoric of donors and their actual practices. And you know, I myself participated in many of these coordinating meetings, which never ever really faced the problems. They basically had to declare success, well, whatever. And at the same time, you had some donors, particularly bilateral ones, doing their own things, completely uncoordinated, isolated from everybody else, in fact, actually undermining some of the work that was being done on institutional development. One only needs to look at the support to subnational government and the chaos around that as a great example of the ineffectiveness and the brokenness of the system. And you could argue if there has been more effective subnational government, then Afghanistan's future might have changed. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair, and also for being so concise. There's also been a point that both Jeremy and Alistair you made in your presentations, which is that it's important in thinking of aid delivery to Taliban to not sort of take responsibility for the provision of assistance and basic services out of the hands of the Taliban. Also, it's not a free pass base. So how to both meet immediate needs while at the same time continuing an engagement with the Taliban on their responsibilities to provide basic services to the people they purport to govern. In that context, can I ask you a question, Mark, about what are the options to provide aid and to explain it to Afghans that it's not being seen as a reward for the Taliban? What safeguarding can be put in place to ensure that the aid does not end up to empower particular local communities, as Alistair has alluded was done so in the past? And Abdullah Tafi, I'm not going to ask all your questions, but I think these are some of the critical points you bring out. Mark.
Well, I think it is going to be a very difficult balance to achieve. The reason for using humanitarian aid as a mechanism is to maintain the neutrality of assistance, and that's one of the key issues. So the options are to slightly broaden the basis of the humanitarian approach, and there are discussions about talking about humanitarian plus, which maintains the neutrality. The other options are to look at the issues of institution building as neutral activities in their own right, and I think that's the route that needs to be gone to go down, and to recognize that institution building is not an issue of legitimization. It's a matter of maintaining state capacity and protection.
Thanks very much, Mark. I think I want to wrap up now two questions that came in, and in fact, it comes from a number of them. A question from Nicole Peach and a point also from Paula Chatterton, which is, I'm going to put it to all the panel, and perhaps, or Sal, I'm going to ask you maybe if you want to start off with, but tell us a little bit about the practical constraints affecting NGOs. Are NGOs from Afghanistan getting foreign funding? Are they able to spend it? Can they engage with national and local authorities, or are they having to go around all the time? So it'd be great to get your perspectives on that. And then I'm going to open up to Jeremy or Hamid to come in here. What is the context of security considerations for the delivery of aid? And is that one of the factors that is leading donors to consider working through multilateral organizations, in a sense, outsourcing risk? But I'm going to start with you, ASLI.
Thank you very much, Renata. With regards to humanitarian aid agencies, to the level that I am gathering insights from different parts of Afghanistan, the authorities have been very cooperative. They are cooperative in the sense of facilitating the services at the local level. They are also cooperative in the sense of ensuring that the aid agencies are being through a kind of a formal registration services, registration processes at the Ministry of Economy and so forth. There are indeed challenges. For example, there has been reports of situations where female aid workers have tried to visit sites and they've been questioned, they've been arrested for a couple of hours in some instances in the southern Afghanistan, asked, what are you doing, why are you doing, so forth. So there are two reasons why such kind of arrests happen. One, when the NGOs, whether international or nationals, they are not coordinating their activities with the local de facto authorities, the Ministry of Economy and so forth. And two, maybe the local authorities are kind of people that are not really capable of understanding what is going on. So the authorities side, they need to really ensure that those who are questioning, who are having the authority to arrest and to ask, they have to be fully trained on the humanitarian principles and ensuring that such kind of disturbance doesn't happen in the process of need assessment and field sites. But on the other side, I mean, to the credit of the existing authorities, by the way, not all of the authorities are the Taliban themselves. They are the former civil servants who are very kind of administrative focused people. And one concrete example I had, it was completely from someone very close who was in Afghanistan and tried to even travel to quite a far and remote area. He was completely supported, and all his trip was without any kind of janjal, as we call it, any kind of headaches or hassles. That tells us that there is that possibility. However, the rules and procedures are in place, and there needs to be some level of understanding, but there needs to be also consideration from aid agencies, local. And I want to make one additional.
I'm going to, if you mind, ASLI, we have 1 minute left, and I would love to bring in so many other points, and there are so many good questions. I'm going to unfortunately have to wrap it up, but let me just say that please do read the reports. They will be on all 4 websites, so there's no way you can miss them. Please do reach out to all of us engaged in this exercise, and especially to Ben and the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub on questions or thoughts. We hope, as ASLI said, this is a continuing conversation. I think a key points coming out, as ASLI highlighted, is aid is possible and action is possible. As Alistair, ASLI and Jeremy, I think, also touched on, a very differentiated picture across the country, and therefore much more need of engagement to think about what Taliban, where, who you acting with, and much more granular knowledge, including of the political economy. Much more understanding too, Hamid didn't get any chance to engage in it, but on the climate challenges and the urban picture, the urban poverty picture that is getting to be quite acute in the country. And then Mark's point about we do need to engage with the Taliban, but how we do it, the degree of coherence, what with, and how we think about the local community engagements will really have to be led through. The UN has a role to play, the World Bank and IMF have a role to play, but as Alistair said, the US and some of its key actions on sanctions will be critical. I would love to continue this. I hope we will continue it as a college. I'd like to thank the 150 or so people that joined these workshops, and please remain in this engaged, all the more so as other challenges for Ukraine and other places challenge attention, resources and engagement. Let me just thank in particular, as we close, everyone involved, but I'd really like to shout out to Mark Bowden for leading us so capably and steering us so well throughout this exercise. Mark, many thanks to you. And finally, to all of those who are committed to Afghanistan and the hope that we will find a better future together with and for the people of Afghanistan. The very best of luck, and look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you.